Imagine a world where the rising sun didn't bring light, but a shadow so cold it froze the very soul. Imagine being 14, your hair tied in braids, your mind filled with the simple dreams of a village girl, only to be told that your country, your body, and your future no longer belong to you. This is not a work of dark fiction. This is the documented, blood-stained reality of the comfort women. The largest state-sponsored system of sexual slavery in modern history. For decades, the world looked away. The history books were scrubbed, and the screams were muffled by the roar of cannons and the silence of shame. But today, we break that silence. We travel back to the 1930s and 40s to uncover a mechanical, industrial-scale nightmare where human beings were reduced to military commodities. This is the story of the stolen spring, a tragedy so profound that it remains a bleeding wound on the face of humanity, the architect of a nightmare. To understand the horror, we must understand the cold logic behind it. The Imperial Japanese Army, as it expanded across Asia, faced a problem. Soldiers were raping local populations, leading to anti-Japanese sentiment and the spread of venereal diseases. The High Command's solution wasn't discipline or morality. It was the creation of comfort stations. They built a supply chain for human bodies. At first, they recruited professional sex workers. But as the war machine grew hungrier, the supply ran dry. That is when the deception began. In the rural villages of Korea, China, and the Philippines, military recruiters arrived with promises of factory work, nursing jobs, or schooling in Japan. Thousands of desperate families, crushed by poverty, handed over their daughters, believing they were sending them to a better life. Others weren't even given the choice of a lie. They were snatched from doorsteps, dragged from fields, or taken at bayonet point while their parents watched in helpless agony. These girls, some as young as 12, were loaded into dark cargo trucks and ship hulls labeled as military supplies, destined for the front lines of a war they never asked for. The geography of hell. When the doors of those trucks finally opened, these girls didn't find factories or hospitals. They found comfort stations, crude wooden shacks, mud huts, or repurposed schools surrounded by barbed wire. From the humid jungles of Burma to the remote islands of the Pacific, the geography of their suffering spanned thousands of miles. Inside these stations, the brutality was calculated and relentless. A woman was assigned a tiny cubicle, often nothing more than a mat on a dirt floor. There, she was forced to service between 20 and 50 soldiers every single day. The lines of men stretched out the door, a conveyor belt of violation that never stopped. The language used by the survivors is haunting. They describe their bodies not as their own, but as public toilets. There was no consent. There was only the survival of the next 10 minutes. If a girl cried, she was beaten. If she resisted, she was slashed with bayonets. If she contracted a disease, she was injected with crude 606, Salvarsan treatments that left her boron and broken. This wasn't just physical pain. It was a systematic attempt to erase their personhood. They were stripped of their names and given Japanese aliases. They were stripped of their clothes and given thin kimonos. They were stripped of their humanity and treated as disposable cogs in a military machine. The psychology of the void. We must talk about the sexual zulm, the profound cruelty of this violation. In Western history, we often focus on the maps and the generals, but we rarely look into the eyes of the girl in the cubicle. Imagine the psychological fragmentation required to survive 40 violations a day. Many survivors speak of a disconnection, of floating above their own bodies, watching the horror from a distance because the reality was too heavy for the heart to hold. They lived in a constant state of terror. The smell of cheap disinfectant, the sound of heavy boots on wooden floors, the sight of a military uniform. These became the triggers of a lifetime of PTSD. There was no privacy, no hygiene, and no mercy. Some girls became pregnant. Their babies were often forcibly aborted or killed upon birth. The level of depravity didn't just target the flesh, it targeted the very concept of motherhood and womanhood. The abandonment. When the atomic bombs fell and the war ended in 1945, the nightmare didn't end. It just changed shape. The Japanese military, desperate to hide evidence of their war crimes, began a mass cover-up. In some locations, comfort stations were set on fire with the women still inside. In others, they were simply abandoned in the middle of foreign jungles with no food, no money, and no way home. Those who did make it back to their villages found a world that had no place for them. In the conservative societies of the 1940s, purity was a woman's only currency. These victims were seen as soiled. They were met with the stinging poison of social stigma. Ashamed and broken, the majority of survivors chose a life of silence. They buried their stories under decades of domestic work, never marrying, never having children, and never telling their families why they screamed in their sleep. The breaking of the seal. For 46 years, this was a secret history. It wasn't until 1991 that the silence was shattered. Kim Hak-soon, a South Korean survivor, stood before a microphone and told the world what had happened to her. Her courage was the spark that lit a wildfire. Suddenly, voices emerged from the shadows. Across Asia, women, now in their 70s and 80s, weeping as they recounted the same horrors. The movement for justice began. These women, known affectionately as halmanis or grandmothers, became the fiercest activists on the planet. Every Wednesday for over 30 years, they have protested in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. Their demand is simple but powerful. A sincere, legal, and unambiguous apology from the Japanese government and the inclusion of this history in school textbooks. The legacy of the unforgotten. Today, the number of survivors is dwindling. Every year, more grandmothers pass away, taking their scars to the grave. But their legacy is immortalized in the statues of peace. Bronze sculptures of a young girl sitting in a chair, an empty chair beside her. The empty chair represents those who didn't survive, and the space left for us to sit and remember. This story matters because comfort women were not a byproduct of war. They were a victim of a philosophy that viewed women's bodies as a theater of war. It reminds us that when we dehumanize one group, we lose our own humanity. To the American viewer, to the global citizen, This is a call to vigilance. History doesn't just repeat itself, it rhymes. And as long as we allow the sexual of the past to be forgotten, we leave the door open for the atrocities of the future. The grandmothers don't want your pity. They want your memory. They want you to look at the statue, sit in the empty chair, and acknowledge that they existed. They were mothers, they were daughters, they were sisters, and for a few dark years, they were the world's most tragic secret. This was the story of thousands of women. Let it never be a secret again.